Thank you for joining me today on this just impromptu call. I wanted to connect with you because you're kind of one of my trusted sources, right? A lot of the way you interpret information and are able to kind of see the tea leaves before everybody else does and just make sense of it more appropriately, perhaps. So I trust you as a resource, as a friend, and I wanted to touch base with you. But I also figured, if I could record this, then it would be useful because I could share it with some of the people in my community as well. So what we're living in interesting times, right?
Hmm. It's a
And
good quote.
unprecedented. I heard you say a word, recently, which you called it a liminal event. Uh,
Yes.
why do you think that this is, you know, as I guess important as it is today?
Whew, well, that's a hard question. Hmm. Okay, so let's start with maybe almost in the beginning. There's a, if we use the metaphor of the addict, the addict has to be an addict means in many ways fundamentally to choose to bullshit yourself, right? To choose to delude yourself, to choose instead of actually perceiving reality to 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 have a preferred delusion, an explanation for what's happening that allows him to continue to be an addict, right? That's the key to the whole thing. And within the addict arc, there's a downward spiral. Right? I mean, if you're deluded, you're not making good choices in the context of reality because reality is trying to tell you what to do, and you're not listening, right?
Yep.
So things get worse. So the delusion has to become more intense, and things get worse, and delusion has to become more intense until you hit rock bottom. Right? Some event occurs where reality hits you so hard that your delusion pops loose for a moment, and you have a moment of clarity, a
Yep.
liminal event. Or you enter into a space where the constructs that you have imposed on yourself that have separated you from effective choice making suddenly drop, and you're able to look around and begin the process of climbing back into sobriety. You may not make it, but at least you have the opportunity to do that. I think this parable is a good parable for where we are as a civilization. Right? We're deeply, deeply addicted, and we've been deeply, deeply separated from reality along a lot of fronts. Right? Pick any part of our civilization, the way that we are married, right? Our dyadic relationships, our families, the way that we educate and raise our children, the way that we produce and distribute and eat food, even the basic stuff, the way that we spend our time and attention, obviously the way that we choose our leaders and the way that we make choices as a community, the way that we run our financial system. These things are all ultimately been running on increasingly intense delusion for a long time and are hyper fragile. And this is an opportunity, really. This event that's hitting us is something that is actually generating a liminal event. Reality is hitting us. We are actually suddenly, so think about how many people right now, in many cases for the first time, actually have to make meaningful choices, which is to say, whatever it was, I don't even know, my time span has gotten very odd because things are happening so fast. But 2 weeks ago, probably for a lot of people, the question of, hey, should I go buy a little like extra food and water came into their mind, right? And their sense-making framework actually had to make a choice. Do I just kind of keep going and doing whatever I do? Or do I actually get out of my normal habit? Maybe it's a little uncomfortable and go do this other thing that possibly even seems weird and wasteful.
Yep.
2 weeks later, you get to find out that the exam comes back and you get to see what kind of grade your sense-making framework had. And you're looking around going, well, shit, the store shelves are now bare. I just happen to have run out of my groceries because, you consume what you got. Maybe that wasn't the best choice. Like even just that, like people are now realizing that they have to actually start making meaningful choices. I noticed my teenage daughters, and by the way, not just people, but also institutions. So San Diego, I've got 2 kids in high school. And on a day, let's call it 8 days ago, an email goes out to parents. Hey, everybody, we know everybody's very concerned about the coronavirus. Just want to let you know that under state law, if you pull your kid out of school, they will have an unexcused absence. And so the bureaucracy, the institution, was literally punishing parents for making that choice.
I agree.
Okay, fast forward 5 days, and the school district says, school's canceled until April 10th or something like that. And here's the best part. And by the way, spring break is now canceled and pulled into that period. So we're basically getting rid of spring break, and we're kind of gluing it into this event. And then like the next day, they send out and say, apologies, no, spring break's going to stay and it's still out. So, all right, so school's canceled. But now what do the parents do?
Yep.
You've got kids that are no longer going to be at school. What's the rule? What's the rule in the house?
Yep.
For my daughters, the rule was in fact what they're calling house arrest, which is to say, sorry, quarantine. They've got their grandparents who live with them, so they need to be more careful than most, or than some actually, than almost no one, to be perfectly frank. But in any event, but only a fraction of their friends are equally under house arrest.
Yep.
Day 2, a much larger fraction of their friends under house arrest. Day 3,
everybody,
effectively everybody, right? And so what's happening is that people are actually just interacting with a changing environment where their habits aren't giving them good answers. They have to actually think about the choices they're going to make.
Yep. And
those choices have consequences, and those consequences land, and possibly land quite significantly. Right, so that's one big piece.
Yep. Continue.
Okay. Next big piece. What is this story about us being addicts? Like, what happened? What's going on here? And one of the things that I think is kind of left hanging out, and that we haven't really built a capacity of in our current civilization, is the recognition of the reality of something that is known as complexity. This notion of what complexity really is and how important it is. In fact, in many ways, how decisive it is, and how we could possibly go forward as humans and live in a durable way. And one of the characteristics of complexity is this notion of systems, like complex systems. There's systems and they hang together in very, very subtle and interlocking ways, and they affect each other. Mm-hmm. So typically we, and this is actually pretty much everybody on the planet right now, except for indigenous people, have used what's called a complicated approach to try to manage complex systems. And this is something I've been harping on for a long time, so I hope it's not boring. But a simple complicated approach is like a silos in a bureaucracy.
Yep.
So I've got an academic, I've got the Department of Mathematics, and I've got the Department of Biology. I've just divided reality into two distinctions. And there's advantages to that. I can specialize in mathematics and really, really focus and learn a lot and go deep analytically, break it down to smaller and smaller pieces. But there's a disadvantage to that, which is that there may be things about mathematics and biology that actually are deeply related to each other. And if I don't have the connections between them that are definitely part of reality, they're not separate, then I'm missing stuff. Right? That's the academic environment. In our social environment, for example, we have this notion that, say, the physical experience of getting a virus, like the actual human embodied experience of getting a virus and getting sick, the institutional structure called the medical system that is more or less responsible for that, the media system that supports the way that we make sense of our environment and the way that we make choices, and let's go with, let's say, the financial system, are distinct. Right? They're governed very differently. And the Federal Reserve does not have responsibility for hospitals, and Kaiser Permanente does not spend a whole lot of time specifically working out what's going on in MSNBC.
Yep.
Well, here we are in a situation where they're all complicated. They're in a complex. They're implicated in each other, and it's very concrete. And we have a very specific, when the number of people who get sick exceeds a certain number, that is the logical, the systemic assumption of our hospitals. How many ICU units, how many doctors, how many ventilators have we economically decided to put in place to support sickness? When a particular event of sickness overwhelms that number, then we actually begin to see what's called a phase transition in the medical system. It's no longer the medical system. Now it's this big broken thing that's spilling harm all over the place.
Yep.
And remember, it goes sideways. So it's not whether necessarily if you get sick from coronavirus. If you're in Seattle right now and you get hit by a car, you're actually much worse off than you were 2 weeks ago because the emergency room is filled with other people.
Yep.
Right? So it cascades out.
Capacity is no longer there. Yeah.
And those are called externalities. And the externalities go up non-linearly in a phase transition, right? So I've got some externalities. When I've got enough beds and I've got enough doctors, it's kind of like filling up a cup with water. As the cup gets filled with water, I could just fill the cup with water. I can just keep pouring more sick people into it. That's okay. So if I get a car wreck, okay, the operating or the ER goes from not as packed to more packed, but it's kind of okay. But once I fill the cup with water, it's a totally different ballgame.
Yep.
Now what happens is a sick person goes from being less able to get access to medical resources to possibly being unable to and die. All right.
Yep.
Well, okay, fine. So we just learned about that. So let's move to another one that seems awfully less connected. Let's go with the financial system. Well, as it turns out, when people are, and let's implicate media in this as well, when people are getting a virus that's, by the way, new, and new is important because novelty is a mystery,
Yep.
then, for example, they start flying less. Their choices change. Local people's choices change because they have this notion, this sense that, oh, I could get sick. And as the media conveys a particular narrative that influences their choices. Well, as people fly less, airlines make less money. And it's, by the way, just like filling a cup again. Up to a certain level, it doesn't matter that much. But past a certain level, the airline system, subsystem, begins to break. Right? They have to just stop sending airplanes. And of course, there's cascade effects. If people aren't traveling as much, then restaurants and events don't have people who are in them. And of course, the events might close down, which has a feedback loop in the opposite direction. Then you've got the financial system. The stock market is watching all of this stuff. And it's like, what's going on? Like in China, the event occurred in China across all these dimensions. The Chinese airline stocks went down before American airline stocks went down. But the people who invest in airline stocks go, well, if this thing becomes a pandemic, American airline stocks and German airline stocks are going to go down. So they start selling.
Yep.
Right? And then you get a panic response at the level of the financial system, which is not like you get a response, like a rational response. The economy is going to shrink, so we need to not be paying as much for this stock. But then as soon as the signal goes, it goes down.
Yep.
And then just to be clear, we have a geopolitical consequence.
Yep.
We saw what happened with oil prices. And whether or not that was a strategic reaction, like, oh, crap, the economy is shrinking, so the demand for oil is going to go down and we need to respond to it, or it was an offensive move. Hey, this is chaos. I should take advantage of a strategic opportunity and try to do something. Like I'm going to grab market share by flushing the price and shutting down people who can't afford to run at that price. Doesn't matter. In either case, that creates a shockwave effect in the financial system that doesn't like big dislocation moves, and of course implications that cascade down to uncertainty, which then feeds back into, say, the political system. So that all these things are connected.
Yep.
And when they're operating normally, we get very complacent, and we kind of forget that we have a deep, deep responsibility, that the civilization that we live in is a rare and precious thing. And the fact that we can tend to go about our day-to-day lives drinking $10 smoothies and not being sick here in the West, at the top of the pyramid in particular, is singular in history, has never happened before. And the baseline is it ain't the case. And so we take a look at those. I personally spend a lot of time. Let's take a look at these various systems that are so crucial in maintaining our quality of life. And I can tell you, they're not in great shape. Right? They're not in good shape. They've in fact gotten very, very, very fragile. And this is part of that notion of the delusion. We've become an addict to a particular lifestyle that tries to pit wealth against resilience. And it uses efficiency in the middle. So efficiency pulls resilience away and gives you wealth, gives you, let's call it plenitude. And that feels pretty cool for a while, right? It's like taking a shot of amphetamines. You get this massive burst of energy, but you're pulling resources from the future into the present to get that burst of energy. You're pulling resilience out of your biological system in exchange for a burst of productivity.
Yep.
And by the way, you can get addicted to it. So it's a good metaphor. And so here we are. Right? We're about to get a really serious, moment of clarity. We're gonna hit. Reality is punching us in the face. And I wrote a Medium article on this recently, like yesterday, saying this is the thing. We need to be very clear that the virus is a risk, but it's one of like 9 risks that are now emerging. And there may be 30 risks tomorrow because it's hard to see. As different systems move, things that were perfectly fine under ordinary circumstances suddenly go outside of their tolerances, and they add more chaos and burden on the rest of the overall system.
Yep. You mentioned in that article yesterday that you know things that base the institution, current civilization, the structures, the ideas, the habits, the feedback loops that are hanging everything together, is in the process of evaporation, right?
Hmm.
And then you start talking about some of the different threat vectors, like various areas that basically could. We're starting to see it now, like just start to crumble. Um, Maybe we can talk about a couple of those, right, and go a little bit more in detail if that's okay.
Sure, it's very concrete.
One of the obvious ones is the medical system, right?
Yep.
And you mentioned already that let's say the beds now if they're overworked because they have more COVID-19 people coming in, then somebody that gets an accident is no longer able to get support potentially, right? And at some point we'll get saturated there, especially if as the virus propagates. What other medical system challenges do you see coming up?
Well, let me give you three. No, let me give you four, and they're very interesting related. So one is doctors and nurses getting sick. Right, we've seen this happen all over the place, and as it turns out, in spite of one, we have a shortage of masks, but the masks don't seem to work very well.
Yep.
Right? So if a doctor is in theater, really surrounded by a lot of sick people for a period of time, and they're not wearing a full-on hazmat suit, they will get sick. And what that means is that 10 to 14 days later, you're going to have to start having doctors and nurses dropping out of the workforce.
Yep.
So our actual capacity of irreplaceable resources, you can't make doctors faster,
Yep.
Starts to drop out. That could be catastrophic, right? That's a really, really big deal. Now, I mentioned also in that essay that we can also think about it in terms of nested layers. So let's say, for example, in Seattle, you've got a real issue. Like you run out of beds, you run out of ventilators, you run out of whatever. But Seattle's part of Washington. And if the rest of Washington is okay, the rest of Washington can kind of like bring resources to bear. But as the pandemic expands, more and more places are implicated directly, and their ability to act as a backstop for their neighbors goes down. So that's a different issue.
Yep.
Okay, let's go with a slightly different one. Let's go with prisons. Prisons are a really interesting and challenging threat vector. You can't really do physical distancing in prisons. They're designed not to be good at that. Right? They're almost perfectly designed to expose everybody.
Yep.
So you can get a lot of sick prisoners. That's a problem. And they're going to, just by themselves, each prison holds more people than can be handled by an entire city's medical system, generally speaking. But guards are also going to be exposed.
Yep.
And if you get sick guards, or you get guards who suddenly are like, I'm not exposing my family to this, and don't go to work, then you actually suddenly start having a criminal or a prison fragility. And we saw this in Italy. My understanding is that something like 50 Italian prisons when I looked at it, were essentially being run by the prisoners. Now that has its own kind of implications in terms of just the human consequences on the prisoners in the prison. But you might imagine a couple of those prisons suddenly stop being prisons, and then they become places where a whole bunch of people who are infected spread, and people who may in fact go to great lengths to not be quarantined.
Yep.
So you got a dissemination vector that's implicated in that. You can do the same thing with the homeless, right? The homeless have been a real problem, particularly in big cities like LA and San Francisco. And we clearly are not good at dealing with that problem. It's a human crisis, and has been on the books for a long time and growing. And now it's becoming, let's say, acute, because again, quarantine is not going to work particularly well on folks who are just living in tents in Skid Row in LA.
Yep.
And they're going to act as simultaneously a reservoir of potential infection for the rest of the population. And in particular, check this out. So let's move to the fourth example in the medical domain. Let's say that we do, in fact, try to do something like a Chinese style hard quarantine, right? President comes on the TV and says, martial law is declared. The National Guard has been brought out. Everybody stay in your house.
Yep.
Right. Well, the troops who are enforcing that, if they're not wearing hazmat suits, are now subject to being infected. Now, as young adults who are probably pretty healthy, more or less, unless they're big smokers, they're probably not exposed to like really serious risk of death, although the consequences of getting sick are seriously non-trivial no matter what. People need to be very clear. This is not the kind of thing that you want to get. But Some of them are going to be taken off the board. So you may have some real depletion of capacity, which means that your wall that's trying to hold the quarantine is going to be leaking in different places, creating a stochastic possibility of just events occurring across that barrier. And of course, every single one of those people, they need resources, they need food, they need water, they away from their families, and they become potential vectors to spread it. And the more you have them on the ground without hazmat suits, the more you're just actually creating a break in your own quarantine. Right?
Understood.
So
Yeah.
that's one, and there's thousands of examples in that subdomain. Let's shift over to the financial domain.
I was just going to say that, people are stopping working now, right? People
Yep.
are working from home or they're stopping working. Certain industries like airlines, hotels, tourism, all affected directly. And then multiple other industries are affected indirectly. And, the worry, I think, is, well, first of all, if people are not working, do they have the means to pay their bills, mortgages and things of that sort, as well as does the economy come to a halt? And it seems like it is, right?
Yeah. Well, let's run a couple of things. And try to think through the implications of this across a bunch of different numbers. So something like 70% of the American population lives paycheck to paycheck. And I'm not going to take that as a humanitarian crisis. I'm going to take that as an example of fragility.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's just be selfish. That's fragility, because what happens is that when something like this occurs, and when the economy does shut down significantly, particularly big sectors of it that tend to be clustered with people who don't happen to have a lot of job security, like in the restaurant industry, you're going to very quickly begin having households that have income less than their costs.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes households that have income of zero and cash reserves of zero, right?
Yep.
And in particular, somebody just sent me a message recently that we're looking at about 6 weeks of having something on the order of 30 million young men with no job, no cash, and no family. Well, they may decide to do things that are antisocial, as they tend to when they're in that circumstance. And that's just a cascade effect, right? So you start having situations where people who literally don't have resources, either at the level of suffering, are getting kicked out of their houses or unable to feed themselves, or having, by the way, declining health because they have now high stress, malnutrition, which makes them an increasingly large vector to get sick across a bunch of different fronts. FYI, historically, that's why the four horsemen include that plague, pestilence, and famine are all part of the same story, because they feed back on each other.
Right.
People get sick, the crops aren't made, people get hungry, they get more easier to get sick, you get a cycle. Okay, let's do another one. Let's go with supply chains. All right, we saw this with China. This was something that we were looking at a while ago, and then finally it became mainstream. But of course, supply chains go in all directions. So now that Italy is shut down and Europe's getting ready to get shut down, the U.S. soon will be shut down, means that whatever supply chains we control, that we're at the bottom of the supply chain, cascades back out to the rest of the world, which just means more cycle dynamics and interruptions and slowing things down. Even if people were going to work, they aren't going to have component parts.
Yep.
And then you've got demand chain, right? There's demand chain going the opposite direction. Obviously, the U.S. is still the consumer of the world. So to the degree which U.S. consumption goes down or goes away in certain sectors, I mean, a friend of mine does very sophisticated financial stuff, and he creates these trading pairs. And he did a trading pair with JETS, which is airline stocks, as an ETF, and then Zoom conferencing. It's basically long Zoom conferencing, short airplanes.
Yep.
Long Netflix, short the NBA.
Yep.
But of course, these have cascade effects. So people all over the world are now going to be impacted by crashing demand for things that they produce in their environment. And so and it's interesting. I noticed that there have been a lot of reports put out by very sophisticated organizations like Goldman Sachs that are sort of projecting certain, frankly, pretty dire consequences. They're not good. They're dire consequences. But I'll put my neck on the chopping block and say that I believe there was a projection, and by the way, I can't remember recalling it incorrectly, of a reduction of global GDP growth to 2%.
Yeah, which seems really.
That seems very optimistic to me.
Very optimistic. I was just going to say that. if I mean, look, right now we're probably at in the very early days in the U.S., right? If this takes conservatively 3 months, maybe more, isn't that half our GDP in the year that's gone? And then how are we expecting? I mean, so that from if you're even talking growth, I think we're going to recede actually, not probably growth, right?
Well, yeah, and again, remember we're talking about fragility. So if this was like the thriving American economy in the mid '60s, that's one thing. But this is an American economy that more or less fell apart at the seams in 2008. Is what was held together with heroic doses of stimulants, levels of methamphetamines that would make an addict shudder.
Yeah,
And now is getting hammered again, right? So things are already breaking. I mean, obviously, the Federal Reserve's response over the past couple of days is sort of, let's call it, not measured.
well,
And
they tried. I mean, they just dropped to zero, but they obviously had zero effect on the markets. The market's like, so what, right?
yeah, what else you got, right? They dropped $5 trillion in commitments to the repo market, and that's out of control. That's absurd. Right? It's an enormous amount, and so what's happening is that unfortunately, addiction to stimulants has that half-life. You got to get
Yeah,
more to get the same hit.
exactly.
And now we're running into headwinds, right? We're not just sort of sitting still. We've got all kinds of things coming at us. And like I said, the geopolitical stuff is there. The geopolitical situation is one where everybody's kind of waiting to see, like, okay, well, how does my position get better? Russia always is looking to play a chess game.
Of course.
China's always looking to play a Go game, right? Our
Yep.
current president apparently likes to play poker. But everybody's trying to figure out how do they get more chips or more, what are they called in Go, the little colored pieces, or more territory on the board for their
Sure.
team.
Yep.
And unfortunately, crisis breeds opportunity. And in that context, all kinds of things are going on. Like disinfo is increasing rapidly, which creates all kinds of decreases of our ability to know what's going on. Various strategic alliances are shifting. I mean, it's a lot. So that's the sense making side of it.
It's interesting, right? I mean, even the position of the U.S. government, I mean, has shifted so drastically in just weeks, right?
Yeah.
Why is it that the world is having a hard time making sense of this, and why is it that you're able to make sense of it a lot faster, a lot more comprehensively than perhaps other people? What's the difference in sense making that's happening?
Well, so one of the things that's clearly happening, and it's impacting everybody, is velocity. Things are happening fast. And this is that whole exponential curve. Right? People have said, like, what is it? If humanity's biggest challenge right now is we don't get the exponential curve. Something like, I'm missing the quote, but we're experiencing that.
Yep.
And I see it actually oftentimes in just on social media. There've only been one case. Why does that matter? How could that possibly matter? There's 1,000 cases. How could that possibly matter? And it's really only people who have in fact had embodied experience with exponential that have the ability to go, yeah, well, 1,000 becomes 1,000,000 in 2 months.
Yep.
And 1,000,000, by the way, becomes everybody 1 month later. Like that's the thing. Like that.
Yep.
That thought experiment of I've got a petri dish, and I put exactly one bacteria in the center of the petri dish, and the next day or the next hour it doubles, and it takes 6 weeks to cover half the petri dish. How much longer does it take to cover the whole petri dish?
Yeah, just a few more days.
1 hour. No, 1 hour. That's the thing, right? It's doubling every hour.
That's true.
The first 6 weeks is doubling from a small base until it covers half. But once it's covered half, the next doubling, which is exactly 1 hour, it goes to the whole. Yep. So it's like you jump out of an airplane and your brain isn't used to moving vertically at real velocity. It's called, I think, ground rush. So you look down, the ground seems far away, far away, far away, far away. Boom, you hit it. That's like a thing that they train you with. It's like we're experiencing ground rush in viral space because it just moves at a rate that we don't make sense of. And then what's happening, of course, is that virtually nobody is trained in their day-to-day lives to be dealing with complexity. So we've got velocity, you've got complexity going on simultaneously. So you just get surprised. It's like imagine firefighters where they're focusing on the fire, and then suddenly, gosh, I don't even know what would be the right metaphor. Like a plague of locusts just shows up out of nowhere and starts like eating their hoses. Like, we don't have to deal with locusts. Like, what the hell? It's
Yeah.
like that kind of thing. Now, in my case, I have kind of three things that have supported me. The one is I started out as an entrepreneur. So at the startup level, like a startup tech entrepreneur. So things like pace of change, in fact, specifically exponential growth, were things that I learned hands-on.
Yep.
And complexity, like having to deal with multiple different modal changes, like dealing with finance and legal and technology and marketing and HR, like all these different things, and having to be able to state switch between them and
Yep.
notice how they fed back into each other.
Yep.
And I wasn't, by the way, trained. I didn't go to business school or anything like that. So I kind of learned it on the streets, as it were. So I kind of had just built competence to do it in general.
Sure.
And then when I quit being an entrepreneur, I didn't just go hang out at fancy islands. I joined the board of a company called the Santa Fe Institute, which happens to be the pioneers in complex system science. So I got a chance to say, okay, all that stuff that I experienced firsthand, let's talk about the theory. How does this theory work? And then about 10 years ago, I got very concerned about the state of the systems as I began digging into each of these systems and asking very smart people who are domain experts about, say, like, nuclear proliferation or concentrations of heavy metals in very specific biological niches. They're like, wow, yeah, it's actually really bad and getting worse fast. Like there's fragility in the domain that I know about. And what I noticed is that two things. Every single one of these experts that I talked to was saying more or less the same thing. And if I asked them about another domain that they weren't familiar with, they were very surprised. Like, yeah,
Interesting.
did you know about this one over here? And they're like, no, God, I had no idea, because we're siloed. We're
Yep.
stuck in vertical disciplines and we don't cross communicate. So about 10 years ago, I basically just took it upon myself to start trying to learn more about precisely what these kinds of things are about, and have been thinking about, talking about, trying to work to address what's happening now. So it's not like there's anything special other than just kind of the sheer circumstance that I was prepared for this event.
So you saw it coming. You also knew that this is one of those phase shift, phase transition type of moments. And now let's talk about what you see playing out. I mean, we talked about some of the risks in terms of medical, financial, government, and so on. What does a month later look like to you? Like, where do you see the world going? And
So,
should we be prepared for that we're not even thinking about or considering right now?
right. So let me just kind of put it in first, like a visual metaphor, and then maybe some scenarios. So the visual metaphor is, let's say I have a marble and I'm rolling it on like a glass table, but the glass table has a big groove in it. Right? I can kind of very easily predict where the marble is going to go. Right? It's going to get into that groove and it's going to follow the groove down. I mean, if the groove's steep enough, it's actually quite difficult to get the marble to move anywhere but the groove. Once it's in it, it's stuck in it. Okay, which is in the language of science, it means a significant activation energy is necessary to change the trajectory of the system. The system in this case is just the marble, and its trajectory is that path. But imagine that what happens is that as the marble's rolling down to the groove gets shallower and shallower. Right? So less and less activation energy is necessary to move it out of the groove. And let's imagine actually there's a certain point where the groove disappears completely and it's on a perfectly smooth table. Absolutely perfectly smooth. And now what you can notice, if you've ever experienced anything like this before, it could go anywhere.
Yep.
Right? Its trajectory now becomes almost completely unpredictable. You've actually moved into a chaos state. All right. So with that as a visual metaphor, what we're looking at right now is some scenarios are scenarios where the things that are happening are kind of lowering the sides of that groove, and so the marble could get kicked out of it. Right. So this is a phase transition. Each one of these subsystems is its own groove. So the medical groove, once medical overwhelm happens, the marble gets kicked out of that groove, and we're in a different level of energy, more uncertainty in the system.
Yep.
Now, there's one big scenario where the powers that be and the kind of our capacities as people to come together and do stuff hold together under all of this. And after some period of time, we're on the other side of something that we can all remember and talk about. And some structural changes have happened, but more or less we're still in the groove.
Sure.
Right?
Somewhat like the 2008
Yeah.
financial scenario, right?
Yeah. Some people made money, some people lost money, big
Yeah.
changes were made, but at the end of the day, the bigger thing kind of stayed the same. And
Got it.
that's some number of scenarios. I don't know what the percentage chance is of that, but it's, it exists. It's there, and it's in many ways one of the more plausible scenarios.
Sure.
Now, of course, as the situation continues to develop, this creates opportunity for change, right? And so this is one of the questions: is agency. Who's actually coming into the system, trying to move things around, like the Saudi Russian oil thing? Those people trying to actually take advantage of chaos or take advantage of crisis and say, oh, hey, maybe I can shift this thing a lot because leverage is there.
Yep.
So one of the questions is going to be, what else happens there? What else happens that's driven by people, by agents, deliberately injecting more chaos into the system because they want to shift the system in their preferred direction,
Sure.
right? Now, if they do that, they might, and we may not notice it, but there's also circumstances where particular injections create cascade effects. There are a whole set of scenarios where things actually spiral out of control, where the amount of complexity is changing every day to the point where, like, we try to solve the problem and our very solution actually creates more problems over here.
Got it.
So in that case,
Risk of misinformation and disinformation all having an effect here as well.
That's a big one. That's a really big one. Misinformation and disinformation, which is sort of a primary weapon of the modern era.
Yep.
And we're very susceptible to it because we don't have trustworthy institutions. We've kind of lost trust of our institutions.
Yep.
And we haven't built new ways to be good at making sense in the modern information environment. So it's sort of like right in the middle of a transition of that capacity, and it's very vulnerable.
Yep.
And so, like in World War II, they had like the loose lips sink ships. This one's something more like see something, say something, or even better, tell the truth is probably the most important thing right now. Like right now, the moral lesson of tell the truth. And so, yeah, I've actually been talking to a couple of folks about it. So in a context like this, let's go with the first scenarios that we kind of muddle through, and we'll be able to know. Like, we'll see if the medical systems start popping, and the financial system starts to move out of in a month, 2 months, it either settles down or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, things will just continue to be really, really, really challenging. Now, generally speaking, I can simplify. Generally speaking, outside of muddle through, you actually have two possible major clusters of scenarios. One's really bad, and one's actually really good, right? Because opportunity. And the determinant of that is actually something I think very powerful, and very fundamental, and in some sense very simple. And the metaphor I'll use is the Depression in Germany and the United States. Okay?
Sure.
So the Great Depression hits. Financial crisis hits. Stock bubble market explodes. And it actually happened in both places. It happened all over the world, but it happened in the US and in Germany. Now, in the US, it was a big deal, right? The financial system was blown up. The economic system was hammered. People were really seriously out of work and impoverished. People were starving, literally starving to death, right? Bad stuff was happening. But at the level of community, it hung together and got stronger. Neighbor helped neighbor. People pulled together. They realized that they had a common weal. They had a common wealth that they all had collective responsibility to maintain. And more or less on the United States, that fabric, the foundational fabric of civilization, actually came together and got stronger. Okay? People did not atomize and become us versus them. They became we. And on the basis of we, economic and financial questions can be solved. Right? Those are really cool things that we use to solve problems. Community is foundational. All right. Yep. Now switch over to Germany. Now, poor Germany had been dealt a bad hand. Right? In World War I, they got absolutely hammered. Their old legacy imperial government of the Kaiser had been booted. So they were sitting on top of the Weimar Republic, which didn't have a lot of legitimacy and was actually run through with all kinds of very hyperbolic competing groups who were much more interested in fighting each other than trying to actually do the right thing for the whole. So their financial system got torn through, their economic system got hammered, but their community fell apart. We became us versus them. And people began looking out for their own interests, withdrawing from the Commonwealth, which made the financial and economic systems even more fragile, which being a downward spiral. Yep. And of course, you then had a transition into Nazism, right? Yep. Which is a very bad place to be. And I'm not saying, by the way, so Venezuela is a similar dynamic in another direction, right? You either got really serious, hardcore, bad authoritarianism or really serious, hardcore, bad chaos. And they kind of, one threatens the other, right? The threat of chaos allows people, says, well, shit, I'd rather have a authoritarian. The threat of authoritarian can lead to chaos. So it's either of those are sort of equivalently bad places to be.
Sure.
And so in many ways, like the ball's in our court as people, as
What you're
individuals.
saying at the end of the day is it's if we are able to maintain a community level of feel, a we feel on the ground, that
Yep,
is essential for seeing how we are able to weather the storm and really what direction we come out of it at the end of the day.
that's right. That's right. And this is so it's one of these things where the die is not cast. Right? It's
Fair?
in our hands. I remember this great scene from the movie Apollo 13,
Yep.
where the guy from Westworld, Ed something, he's the guy who's like wearing the vest and the tie, and in the background are the sort of the kind of the more bureaucratic, but the administrative heads, like the guys who are his bosses, but aren't responsible, sitting in the back talking, and they're like, "Oh, the big storm's coming, and all these things failing, and blah blah blah." It's like, yeah, I mean, this is going to be the greatest disaster in NASA history. And he like tightens his tie and turns and says, "Gentlemen, I think this is going to be our finest hour." And that's the difference, right? The difference is he was fucking committed. He was going to make it work. And in that context, crisis is an opportunity for building entirely new good things. Now remember, wind all back to the beginning. This crisis is not the problem. This crisis is a symptom of the fact that we are addicts. We are addicted to extracting plenitude in exchange for fragility.
Yep.
And the good news is you can actually have both abundance and resilience. And those two are mutually compatible. There's a place to go, which is actually based upon very clearly building more we and less us versus them, where you actually get to have abundance and resilience. And you completely can deal with these kinds of problems enduringly.
And the we today we're talking about is at the community level, but really we're also talking we at the global level, right? One of the criticisms of the way this crisis has been handled is that the U.S. used to be the leader in terms of getting everybody to work together on a global plane. Unfortunately, we have not been the leader in this particular case, and it's a situation where globally, there could be a lot more cooperation. There could be a lot more of how do we solve this together and share information and share resources to get to a place where we're all benefiting. We're not there yet. Maybe we'll get there. My hope is there, but the we part is really community and global, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But we have to be very clear. It can't be naive. Right? It's really crucial. And by the way, I was just thinking this as you were saying it, that in the past, under the American hegemony, like it's quite clear. After World War II, under the American hegemony, we led, and we led for two reasons. We led because, in some sense, we were the best position to lead. If anybody was going to lead, it was going to be us. And if we didn't lead, it was going to be hard for other people to pull things off. But we also led because nobody else had any choice. What America decided to do, everybody else was more or less going to have to play within that construct. And in many cases, I think we tried to lead with the real intent of for the benefit of all. Not in all cases, for sure, but in many cases. I think that was the American empire. Unfortunately, we decided to go the imperial route. Was in the larger arc of history a relatively benevolent empire, but it ain't there no more. Right? We're now in a mode of a truly multipolar world. China can definitely decide its own fate. Europe can decide its own fate. Russia is sophisticated at deciding their own fate. Like they punch above their grade. And America can no longer simply move left, and everybody has to move left with us. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because now it means that if there is going to be cooperation, it actually has to be cooperation. People actually have to choose to cooperate on the basis of true community. So, and that's going to be an interesting question, because I can't help it. Governments aren't good at that. And the kinds of people who tend to rise to the top of large bureaucratic institutions tend not to be the kinds of people who are good at that. Right? They tend to be the kinds of people who are good at making sure they win.
Fair.
They win us them games.
So we have some work to do there, right?
Yeah, quite rapidly, by the way.
Yeah, agreed. And so a couple of things you mentioned, right, in your article that you wrote yesterday. we're moving towards what you want to see as maybe what's called a self-organizing collective intelligence, right? Um, Talk a little bit about that, because what you're really saying is that's the formula
Yeah.
for if we are able to put that in place into this we community over a period of time, that helps us solve for a number of the fragility, system states that we're in currently today.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really frankly, just two dimensions to it. It's not actually that complicated. So one dimension again is just this basic notion of community, right? It's the notion of people choosing to collaborate to achieve greater than they could individually, and in support of something that all of them consider to be mutually valuable. Right? We're familiar with that. Thank
Yeah.
God. And it's just getting better at that, like actually getting better at doing things like, okay, where can I contribute my value best to support the larger story? And how do I discern, who are the people that I should be supporting and listening to, all that kind of stuff, like just getting better at that. But then the second is the world that we are in at the technological level in particular affords such a capacity to communicate and to coordinate and to do together across at a global scale that just wasn't present prior to now. The good folks of the 50s and the 60s built the world we live in using the tools of radio, television, automobiles. Interstate highways were like the big thing during the Eisenhower administration, and they built that world. We're still largely using the institutional structures that were built by and for that world.
Yep.
Okay, it is entirely possible, like no question, that as we begin to innovate new structures of coordination that are appropriate to capabilities of the contemporary environment, that those structures for coordination will be vastly more effective, more capable, more capacited, less expensive, will produce less uncertainty and less externalities, less blowback, less unintended consequences.
Sure.
Can be completely non-extractive and can actually be the kinds of things that people enjoy participating in. They don't have to actually sort of subordinate their personal aspirations to kind of be a good worker.
Yep.
More to the point, they're the only things that can deal with the pace and complexity of the environment that we're in.
Yep.
So what does that look like? Let me just give you like a very simple example. I'll do like a two topologically. One's already happening. Right? One is this global mass movement to be able to find, curate, process, and present real-time, accurate, true information about what's going on that people can use.
Yep.
Right? And that's happening right now, and it's happening very well. I think it is the general experience that the internet, net is doing just a flat out better job than the official channels at getting information to people.
Yep.
Right. And I mean that, by the way, what's really beautiful about it is they can be quite nuanced. Right? So if I just need to know a few things, I can get that. If I need to know very specific things, either local to me or local to my area of expertise, I get that too. Right? It's this very fine-grained thing that couldn't happen. Like when I'm watching NBC, everybody has to watch the same show. So they maybe, even if they're doing their best, they're barely giving me anything relevant to me.
Yep.
And and frankly, they're very rarely doing their best these days. Okay, so that's one simple one.
Sure.
And it's kind of rote. I mean, we've seen this happen. Craigslist replaced classifieds. This is that, but just doing that in the domain of real-time information and building out, by the way, building out content. So right now we're seeing the emergence of community groups. And these community groups, all of them are kind of trying to solve the basic same set of problems. How do we make sure that everybody in the community has enough food and water? How do we make sure we take care of the elderly? How do we take care of kids so that parents can actually go do other stuff that the community needs? Like if you've got a single mom who's a nurse, somebody in your community needs to go to her and say, we will take care of your kid because you're taking care of this community. Agreed. Right?
And
so
I've
that's
seen
happening.
Google spreadsheets on that. There's handbooks people are writing about the coronavirus tech handbook as an example of a
good one, real good.
Basically where you can get all the information pertinent from many different places and figure out how to
collaborate. And remember,
right?
That's not being produced by the CDC. Right? Exactly. That's being hacked together by just people doing it. And as better people come online, people are just handing it off to him and say, you do it. All right.
Yeah.
And it's building, building, building. And by the
Open
way,
source type of community effort on very
yeah.
focused areas, right? So love that.
So let's take that. Now let's do the next one. The next one is like, okay, what about hard stuff, right? I mean, don't we still need to have, NASA to go to the moon? And I think we may, but let's not for long. But let's do one like in the tech sector.
Sure.
So one of the biggest challenges that we have, and by maybe even in fact the central challenge is detection. This thing has a powerful characteristic of being undetected. People are asymptomatic for a long time. So you've got, they walk among you. There are people
5 days to 14 days.
Yeah. So there are people who don't have a clue that they're sick.
Yeah.
Walking around, creating the possibility of the people getting sick.
Yep.
Right? That's more or less the whole problem. And even if we were to institute a major quarantine, if we can't detect whether or not there are sick people getting around, if the sickness is still spreading, we don't know when to stop.
Yeah, we don't.
If we do stop, we don't know if the second wave's come through. Right? So detection is a major problem. And there's a lot of Americans, and they're spread out all over the place. And our current detection technology isn't up to snuff. It's too slow. It's 70s technology. Right? They have to actually ship them back to a big lab and batch process. I mean, all that crap. All right. Already exists a technology that can solve the problem. It's called gene radar. Right? Fortunately, that information processing thing brought this to my attention. A bunch of smart people know this is the case. They talked to the people who were there, checked it. They said, oh, wow, this thing was built to deal with the Zika virus. It can totally be repurposed to the coronavirus. Already has been. It's already in FDA fast-track trials to solve the problem. Right? So we can, yes. And it could be scaled to be able to get a device in the hands of every hospital in the country and could do 5 million tests a day. Okay? Now here's the thing. We could do that through a couple different paths. One path might be the White House. White House might say, that's part of the solution. Go, make it happen. Old-fashioned government. And that would be great, right? Great solution. Another path might be more decentralized, right? The Mormon Church. These guys worked wonders during Katrina. There are Mormons everywhere. They have a lot of resources, and all of them already have food and water taken care of. And frankly, they have an unusually larger than general level of care for community.
Yep.
Well, the Mormon Church could become as effective at dealing with this virus as the WHO and the CDC as combined, because the leverage of technology could enable that to happen. Right? It wouldn't actually, for $250 million and with people being able to pull together, like a whole community of people working together, again, boom, could be done. And in fact, you could do a freaking Kickstarter. You could get people signed up all over the country to say, I will take one when it's ready, and I will make sure that we're ready to start doing testing, pull together $250 million, get the supply chain managed appropriately. We could do a full Apollo 13 project, but at the community level. And any one of these three paths could be done right now. We have the capacity to do it. The hard science and R&D has been done, but we had to find it, right? It's an information processing. And I mean, one, it's important in the context of where we are right now. But two, I think it's also very important to grasp that this is generally the case. We've got a lot of problems we have to solve as a civilization. Most of the solutions we already have. It's not really about inventing new things. In some cases, there will be, but in most cases, it's actually finding the people who've actually been doing incredible work for decades that haven't been perceived and upregulated by our current fragile institutions.
Yeah.
And then resourcing them in a context that actually has the leverage of communitas. Right? That is almost certainly the solution that moves us through this thing to the other side.
Fantastic.
All right, man.
Thank you.
You got it. That was fun.
My friend. Appreciate it. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I think this is going to be very helpful for people to understand. The virus is step one. It's what everybody's focused on. But we're really here talking about the second order, third order items that are really, cascade effects of the virus.
Yeah, you just reminded me. I forgot. So we did that whole loop, and I just want to loop back to this notion of global, because I think it's very, very important for everyone to get into their consciousness that nation states are fake. Right? They're artificial. These are the only thing that is real. Okay. And if we just get that in our head and we take full responsibility as individuals for the well-being of our fellows, for the common, what is it called? The brotherhood of man, then we're good to go. Right? We can deal with it.
Agreed.
All right. That's all, brother.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Love you. See you soon. Take care.